Hello and welcome to our seventh CAHRS webcast of 2022. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conedy Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School, and I also serve as the Academic Director of CAHRS. Today I'm joined by my colleague Beth Flynn-Ferry, who serves as the Executive Director of CAHRS. In recent years, as we all know, the human resources function has taken on an increasingly central role in helping to navigate the many emerging challenges that we've been experiencing, as well as adapting to the changing world of work and supporting organizational transformation. As the role of HR becomes more expansive as well as more complex, it's important to evaluate whether our HR capability efforts are keeping pace. Over the past several months, Beth and I have conducted several working groups with a variety of CAHRS partners and have talked about how they are thinking about developing HR capabilities. What we'd like to do is share some of those insights with you today. And so let me give you a flavor of what we're going to be doing over the next 30 minutes or so. We'll start by sharing some of our insights that have emerged from our conversations with our various CAHRS companies. However, we also want to really make this webcast interactive and engaging and learn from you in the process. What HR capabilities is your organization focusing on? What approaches are you using to building them? To facilitate this exchange, we'll be using an interactive polling feature called Poll Everywhere, which will enable you to submit responses through a browser or on your phone. When we get to the polls, I'll give you more information about how to log into the system and submit your responses, but you might want to have a phone available for when we get to that point of the program. Throughout the presentation, I also encourage you to please submit your questions or comments through the Q&A function here in Zoom. We'll be monitoring those as they come in, and maybe we'll take some along the way, but we'll hopefully have some time at the end of today's session to address your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth.
Great. Thanks, Brad, and welcome, everybody. I want to start with saying things are definitely changing in the HR world, and we are up for the challenge, but there's three areas of focus that we want to talk about today. While many of the HR capability areas that we focused on in the past still hold, as your organizations and as society around us change, there's an increased emphasis on certain skills and capabilities, and we'll talk about what those are. The second thing we'll talk about is not only are the needs of the organization changing and different, but also employee preferences for learning and development have changed too. Working in a hybrid world is leading to virtual learning, companies needing to offer engaging, more personalized, and delivered in a more cost-effective manner. And the last area that we're going to talk about is a common challenge area, and that is how HR career development happens in this new hybrid world. But let's talk about the first area, HR skill building and capability first. As HR has taken on a more central leadership role in managing the business, there's a growing need for HR training and development. We've talked about ourselves as the cobbler's children for many years. We kind of put HR last on the development front, always putting our client needs first. This really needs to change so HR can better support the business by developing our own skills. And overall here, companies are moving away from traditional competency-based learning and towards skill building. A few years ago in 2018, CAHRS developed some models for HR business partner and centers of excellence leader that talks about the roles and responsibilities, traits and attributes, and competencies and capabilities. So here's a look at the one for the HRBP leaders. As we look at this model now in 2022, what we're finding is the buckets still hold true for the most part, but the emphases are changing. And so the yellow highlights are areas of increased focus. If we look at the same model from 2018 for the COE leaders, you take a quick look here, but go to the next slide. The yellow area here also highlights a lot of what we're doing is the same, but the emphasis and where we need to focus and build our skills is changing given the world around us. So let me delve into that in a little more detail on this slide. So there's really 4 areas of HR expertise that companies are increasing their focus on. The first one is compensation. You think about, first of all, from how we had to deal with paying remote workers to now dealing with inflation impact, to pay transparency laws that are being passed in some of our states. The game has changed here, and HR needs to skill up. The second area is talent management. We're talking about that all the time, talent acquisition, retention, and development in this low unemployment, but pre-recessionary environment is calling for a real higher level of expertise. The third area is labor relations. And it's, as you know, it's been a really tight labor market, and this has allowed labor unions to increase their power for some years. It used to be in the old days that we started HR folks in the plants, they got an experience and exposure to labor relations and employee relations in those arenas. But that's kind of gone away, and labor relations has become a more specialized domain. And so there's a need here to skill up HRBPs and others in this area. And the last one is well-being. Emotional, psychological, physical burnout are all impacting the workforce and us in HR. And we've put a priority on programming and tactics to address this fatigue and stress in the workplace. There's different tactics that companies are taking, things like Focus Fridays, where no meetings are scheduled, in place of what used to be summer hour Fridays and other things. But this was a more specialized area, but we really need to skill up more folks in HR on well-being and how to deal with it. If we go to the right side of the page here, there are 4 HR skills or capabilities that our partners are focusing most on today. The first one is business acumen, which isn't necessarily new. We've been talking about this for a while, but it's shifting a little bit. At the junior levels, the focus is on understanding the financials and key metrics of the business. But at the senior levels, it's really thinking about business leadership versus acumen. So how are we using the HR levers to lead the business in the environment we're in today? The second one is strategic thinking. Here, to be more effective, HR really needs to think critically, logically, and strategically to help the business meet its current and future talent and organization needs, and develop plans to address any gaps that are there. Thirdly, consulting and business partnering skills. Given the rate of change and growing needs of the business, contracting and prioritizing work are a key area of development for us. It's hard for us to say no. And while development of consulting skills has traditionally been a requirement for HR business partners, there's a growing need for COE leaders to learn this skill as they lean in more to business issues as well. And lastly, digital and data analytics. This has been dialed up as well, given the hybrid environment and more virtual and distance type of working and learning. So understanding how digital is impacting the business is a key area of development for us. And with an increase in information, HR needs to know how to both interpret and tell the story using data.
Great, thanks, Beth. So we'd love to hear from you how these different areas maybe align or don't with some of the areas that you're focusing on in your own organization. So this is where we'd like to launch our first poll. So to join in, so you'll be able to answer the poll, you can either scan the QR code that's on the screen here with your phone, or if you prefer, you can just type the web address on the right into a browser. Either option should get you to the same place. And when you're in, you should see our first poll, which asks you what HR skills and capabilities is your company focusing on. So you can just type in areas that you're focused on. Feel free to submit a couple different responses. That's fine. We'd love to get as many of your insights as possible. So we see some coming in so far here. So seems like data analytics is showing up in a big way, which is certainly in line with some of the themes that Beth just highlighted. Kind of the business acumen piece is also showing up there.
The empathy piece is another one I see out there, which is definitely one that's dialed up post-pandemic here.
It's interesting how many of these you might consider kind of, except for maybe empathy, how many of these are maybe more kind of technical hard skills around analytics, around digital. We even see technical in there.
Automation.
Yeah, exactly. That was another one I noticed.
I'm happy to see the business being the core, though. That's why we're here, right?
Yeah, the business and the data piece definitely seem to be showing up there in the center as the kind of core areas. change,
Yeah.
teaming, another interesting one.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot of changes in as we have more kind of remote and virtual and hybrid teams. That's created new challenges for us as both team members and team leaders. Diversity.
Terrific.
Great. Thank you for all your responses. I think this is certainly a highlights, I think, some of the challenge that we're facing in that there's a lot here, obviously, a lot of different areas that your organizations are focusing on. And I'm guessing many of these overlap across your organizations as well, suggesting that there's a fairly large, significant mandate here in terms of the capabilities that we're looking to build in the function. So we'll be coming back to a few other polls as we move along here. Talk a little bit about different approaches that we've heard to supporting HR learning and development. And just let me throw a reminder out that we'd love to have your questions or comments. You can submit those in the Q&A. We did have one come in about sharing the slides, which we will be sending out to all of you following the session. But please do share any questions or thoughts you have as we go along. So our working groups provided insight into the approaches that organizations are using to help support HR learning and development. We wanted to highlight a few in particular that we found particularly innovative in terms of really the extent to which they were addressing specific challenges that surround learning and development in the current context in which we find ourselves. So the first strategy is creating dedicated time for learning and engagement. Now, this might seem fairly straightforward and simple, but in fact, this is really a crucial strategy at a time when HR has been operating at full tilt for the last few years, where there's a significant amount of burnout and limited bandwidth among our HR function. As a result, simply getting HR partners to take the time to participate in learning is a key challenge. So to address this, many organizations have been becoming more intentional in terms of really bringing HR together, particularly when they're co-located or find themselves together in the office for dedicated learning and engagement time. For instance, one organization that we talked to scheduled enablement sessions with the goal of really forcing HR to step away from their day-to-day responsibilities to reduce the risk of multitasking and really giving them the space to really focus on their own development. A second and somewhat related strategy is to create an effortless learning experience. Now, as we all know, learning itself should be and often is hard and difficult and challenging. But what shouldn't be hard is the ability for individuals to find, consume, and really think about how learning applies back to their careers. To facilitate a more effortless learning experience, we're seeing many organizations leverage digital platforms to provide a more personalized or customized learning experience. These platforms can provide suggested training, gig assignments, or mentors based on an individual's specific learning needs. In addition, these platforms often leverage micro-learnings, which allows individuals to kind of squeeze that learning into those small spaces that they might have in their otherwise busy schedules. A third approach that we've heard from many organizations is really to empower learners by allowing them more choice in deciding what and when to learn. The self-managed approach is driven by individual interests, needs, and availability. When combined with the prior approach of the digital platforms that's providing those learning recommendations, this empowerment approach can really help kind of create a balanced L&D strategy that leverages both kind of top-down and bottom-up influences. That is, it really kind of helps to focus learners on those key capability areas that the organization feels is most critical, but then bottom-up really allows them the freedom in terms of deciding how and when they go about developing these capabilities. Finally, many organizations are striving to make learning and development for their HR function more inclusive. In the past, we often had programs that were really restricted to specific populations based on various segmentation criteria. It might be, programs for only certain levels of the function, might be restricted to certain types of roles, or it could be based on an individual's potential or performance. But given the breadth and diversity of all the learning needs today, not to mention the accelerated mobility of individuals across different parts of the function, more and more organizations are democratizing learning as a way to really open up programs more broadly. For example, one company that we talked to created an HR Academy which is really designed to serve the entire function and curated different types of skill-based learning and structured those to fit into different time slots, sessions ranging from everywhere from 2 minutes up to an hour, again, to really allow for different depths of learning, but also to fit that learning into individuals' busy schedules. So these are just a few of the approaches that we've heard. We'd love to hear some of the approaches that you're focused on in your organizations. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our second poll, which you should see come up there in your Poll Everywhere screen. And that question is, which of the following approaches does your organization rely on the most for HR learning and development? So you can rank order the choices that we have laid out for you there. And would love to see kind of how these different approaches, the degree to which you're emphasizing or maybe not, these within your own organization.
And while you guys are answering that, we did get a question in about the language used between skills, capabilities, et cetera. And that's a really tough one. I think, you know, as we talked with the different companies in our sessions, companies use those a little bit interchangeably. So the information I shared, except for the HR model that we produced a few years ago, isn't real. So it's a little loose, Eileen, I would say.
Great. So thanks for your responses to this question. I was wrong that our next poll was the one where we asked you to rank. So here is just selecting which option is kind of most prevalent in your organization. I think what we see clearly is that really the kind of on-the-job development is the key focal area, which aligns, as we know, with the kind of 70-20-10 model that many organizations have taken to development, where 70% of that learning is occurring on the job or through experience, 20% through relationships, coaching, mentoring, and then 10% through more kind of formal learning. I think as someone that studies and teaches training and development, I think what's really fascinating here is the fact that no one is selecting internal or external classroom training, which again kind of is indicative of the trends that we've seen where virtual learning out of necessity really took over during the pandemic with a steep drop in more in-person learning. Really interested to see overall what that mix looks like going forward. A lot of surveys suggest that organizations are planning to bring formal in-person learning back, but certainly we're seeing, you know, organizations close their learning centers or corporate universities. So it'll be really interesting to see this mix of virtual and in-person learning going forward. But again, these results really suggest that on-the-job development, more experiential learning seems to be the key focal area here. So with that, Beth, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the key challenge area.
Yeah, sounds good. You know, one area that did in our discussions was the ongoing challenge, because this isn't a new challenge, but it's more difficult in the world we're operating today, is how do we develop folks for HR careers? And so a few of the things that our partners mentioned were, you know, companies really value broader exposure to HR through different experiences. But there's some resistance in the organizations to career shifts between HR business partner roles and centers of excellence or expertise type of roles. Some of that resistance comes from the HR employees themselves. Other resistance comes from our business leaders who, you know, want to keep expertise where it is. But to counter this, one organization we talked to has adopted a career lattice framework versus a ladder. So a lattice may be hopping around. You might move vertically, you might move horizontally, you might move diagonally, and it gives you different directions to gain a broad range of experiences. Another organization talked about creating day in the life profile for some HR roles to really create visibility and make them more tangible to people by describing the skills, needs, and the value of those roles to folks. Another area that was talked about was that a more inclusive approach is needed across the HR organization for development. So high priority. And at the senior level, so director to VP type of level, there's generally a well-established process and a lot of support in place for career progression, including things like leader assessments, coaching, established pathing for certain development experiences, training, etc. But for those more junior in the organization, this tends to be less defined and less supported, was what we were hearing. And lastly, with the world changing around us so quickly these days, learning agility and fast learning agility is a key focus. In fact, one organization is going to an extreme where they're rotating their senior HR leadership team every 6 months to build learning agility and give the team a more holistic view of the entire business. So I'll be curious to see the impact that has in the organization. We're used to the rotations being faster, maybe at the junior levels, which is more exposure, but at the senior levels where you really need to have leadership and impact, I think this is a experiment we'll be interested in.
Great. So we have one final poll for you. So I'll activate that. You should see it on your screen, and you can go ahead. And this is the one where we do ask you to rank order different career pathing approaches within your organization. So we're interested in understanding how HR career pathing is changing in your organization and which approaches may be, again, more or less utilized within your organization. So we're starting to see some responses, some ordering come in. It seems like right now, kind of these more fluid career paths, more lattice paths, as opposed to the ladder-based, just kind of linear upward paths seems to be the primary focus, followed by more movement between the HRBP and COE roles. Seem like the last two, in terms of faster rotations, well-established processes, were kind of going back and forth, but seem to be less emphasized in your organizations.
I'll take the question, Brad. Sound good?
Great, go ahead.
Yeah, Ian's asking, are we seeing HR's need for partnership and ecosystem builds outside of their company? For example, since you can't always move as fast or learn as fast to keep up with changing needs, does brokering, partnering, building relationships with external experts become more important for service delivery and impact? I definitely think that is an approach. A spin on that even more is we've got a nucleus of CAHRS companies that have come together, and not for HR right now, although they are talking about doing this for HR. They're partnering those different companies to give them different experiences and exposure through training or spending a day at another company where they're hearing. So you might have 5 or 6 companies, people spending a day at a host company where their leaders talk to this diverse group of company leaders about whatever their, if it's supply chain or if it's finance, whatever the exposure is. And build that together and then rotate to a different company. And there's even talk about kind of exchanging people in roles, almost like exchange students or, going to a nonprofit where you fill a role for a little bit of time, exchanging talent that way because they can, build up those exposures more quickly. It also builds good relationships between companies. You just have to worry about competition a little bit or grabbing the talent, but they've set up some agreements that make that permissible, and we're exploring that for HR as well.
Yeah, I'll just build on that, Beth, too, and note that the models that you highlighted earlier that we developed back in 2018, that was a key area that came up, particularly in the COE model, which was this need for COE leaders really to be in tune with kind of trends and things going on externally outside the organization. I think there's a tendency often for us to become quite kind of siloed or insular. And even at that time, which is pre-pandemic, that really showed up in our work as something we heard repeatedly across different organizations, the need to really be in tune with those external trends through benchmarking with other companies or just being connected in with your kind of whatever your specialty area is, going to conferences, et cetera. So I think that's one was present, but is become even more important in recent years. We have time for maybe one more question. I saw one come in, Beth, through the chat directed towards us, which was, you talked about mobility and The question is, how do you really we know mobility is helpful for building skills and developing skills, has a lot of benefits, but there's often a resistance, particularly among managers, to really facilitating mobility or to giving up talent. And were there any discussions in the working groups that you did that kind of address those cultural elements of, mobility?
Yeah, that definitely came up as a barrier or an issue for companies. I think, the solutions there are, helping your clients or your business partners understand the long game, right? How you want to develop your talent and where they're going for those other kinds of roles, and that it's important in certain cultures, not every company, but certain cultures, to have those broader level exposures. And so I think, that's up to your CHRO and kind of contracting with the senior leadership team around how they want to do that kind of development, and then figuring out, the impact on the business. When is the right time to do those kind of things in partnership?
Great. Yeah, and I just did a working group yesterday around some talent strategy and heard many of the same things, really helping people see kind of the business impact of mobility. We also heard some organizations creating dashboards that kind of highlight who is or who is not kind of net talent exporters. So creating some accountability mechanisms there as well.